It's very important. Let me just pause quickly. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Fundraising Talk. This is an initiative where we bring together fellow fundraisers and fellow colleagues in the not-for-profit sector. We share best practice, we share great resources, and we support each other. This is facilitated by my co-host, Melanie Jackson, and myself. Disclosure, we're not the experts on every subject matter. What we do is we take international best practice and our many years of experience and bring that together to share with you, our fellow fundraisers and those working in the nonprofit space. So thank you for joining us on another fundraising talk. Today we're going to be talking about stakeholder mapping. And if you haven't already done this, this is a great hour-long session that will give you the insights. And it's a perfect time of the year to be doing this when you're doing your strategy and your planning for 2021. And even if you've done your planning for 2021, you can go back and do a little bit of tweaking once you've been through the session. And there's some wonderful tools that we'll be sharing with you in the next 60 minutes. So without any further ado, let me get to the next slide. Welcome, and please sit back and enjoy. If we can, okay, Lindy, you can go on. Al?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I've pressed mute because I have very loud ducksies who like to get involved in my conversations, and then I forget to unmute. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to have you. We've got a nice group today, and I hope it's going to be really interactive and you have lots of questions to ask. I just wanted to remind you of a couple of things. If you can keep your sound on mute and your videos off until we get to the Q&A section, and just also that please feel free to put questions into the chat. If you feel that it's a question that you don't want people to know you asked, please feel free to private message Calvin or myself, and we will ask the question anonymously. And then a last little reminder that we do record these sessions. They are available on YouTube normally by the end of the day. And the reason we put the little disclaimer in is just to remind you that things that go on the internet are there forever. So when you ask a question, be cautious, or as I say, alternatively, do it anonymously. Just ask your question to Calvin or myself privately, and we will share the question.
Thank you, Melanie. So that's us. For those of you that don't know us, our contact details. I work in the nonprofit space, working with charities to improve, to do better. And those are my contact details, and have been in this sector for many years, worked across many local and international charities, and very privileged to be able to serve every day and work in an environment where every single day I know that all the hours of blood, sweat, and tears is making a difference to make our country and our world a better place. Melanie?
Absolutely. I think we definitely come into this sort of industry for the love and not the money. I run an organization called Words That Count, and our focus has, interestingly, particularly over COVID, shifted very strongly back into the words and the words that we write and the words that we say. So my focus is around the development of collateral, around raising funds. I'm also starting to work in the startup space, which is super exciting. But my heart is always in the nonprofit sector, and I love what I do. I love the privilege of being able to do what we do, and I hope you're going to have a good session today.
Cool. I just want to make sure that people are muted. 1 second. Just get. Okay. People are all muted. Sorry, there was somebody that wasn't muted. All right, so let's get into it, ladies and gentlemen. So some definitions. What is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is any person, group, or institution with an interest in your project or your organization. They may not necessarily be the decision maker, but they may be an influencer. They can open to the decision maker. They can show an interest. They can share your story. And they need not directly be affected by the project. And this is a big misnomer. A lot of nonprofit organizations presume that the only stakeholders are the beneficiaries. That is completely untrue. Your stakeholders are your donors, are your media partners, are your internal stakeholders, which is your board and your staff, and your beneficiaries, and the greater space in which you work in. So if you're working in ECD space, one of your stakeholders is the ECD sector. If you're working in the environmental space, one of the stakeholders is the environmental sector, your local government, your national government, your decision makers. So stakeholders is anyone that can influence and support your organization directly or indirectly by whatever means, shape, or form. And then what is a stakeholder analysis? So a stakeholder analysis is then identifying organizations or projects that are key stakeholders, assessment of interests and how they affect your organization or your project directly or indirectly. So for example, if you're working in the wilderness and you're working in an environmental project and government passes legislation that you may not cut down another tree for the next 10 years, or you may not harvest fish because of a depletion of stock, and your project is about creating jobs through fishing, that's going to affect your business. So you've got your stakeholder, and then you've got your stakeholder analysis. And we're going to be unpacking both of these today. So that's why it was important for us to just share the definitions right in the beginning so that we can set the foundation and set the groundwork. Mel?
Yes. So you may have encountered this before, and I have a dreadful confession that might make you feel better if you haven't. I had not encountered this until recently when I started working in stakeholder analysis. And it's a very well-known system for looking in a very holistic way at an organization's stakeholders. Now, this can apply to a company, a nonprofit, a governmental agency. It really has a very broad sort of umbrella set of definitions. The trick is to take those things that apply to your organization and your situation and make them work for you, lay them out. And what's interesting about this is people are encouraged to actually do it visually. Put pieces of paper up in different colors and all kinds of things. The whole idea of this is that it's very much a workshop type of intervention. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the political environment, because if we work in communities, we can't get away from politics. Inevitably, we will need to deal with the ward councillor. We will need to deal with local governments, maybe even provincial or even national government. So we've got to look at the politics and how that plays into our work and how it affects our work. Of course, we can't ignore the economy. I think there are times when we wish we could, but unfortunately not. And we can see as fundraisers today working during the pandemic, it's so important to keep an eye on the economy. Who's making money? Who's not making money? Because there definitely are pockets of donors that have done exceptionally well over COVID. So how do we attract them? How do we interest them in our work? Social and cultural, critical. It's very interesting. I work with an organization that works in several African countries, and it works with young girls. And we were looking at expanding a behavior change model program away from discouraging girls from starting smoking into something different. And we really thought about what that something should be. And eventually we hit upon cervical cancer and the vaccine for cervical cancer. We ran it past the Ghanaian group and they were horrified. They were like, no, you cannot talk about that because that's linked to personal stuff. And it was not understanding the cultural norms in that country that led to us making that mistake. And luckily, we were stopped before we could really do damage to the organization. So it's making sure you understand the demography, education levels, what's acceptable, what religions are at play, what faith, what belief. Really, really important stuff. We can't get away from technology. At every turn, it's the fourth industrial revolution and everything that it's going to bring with it, from AI to robots writing news stories, which scares me a little. What's happening in your community from that perspective? Is there something you can tap into? Is there something you need to be conscious of? Of course, legalities. I mean, our society is so legislated, it's not even funny. and not even just in South Africa, I think globally, we have some legislation addicts floating around the halls of power, and we really can fall foul of the law quite easily. So we need to keep an eye on that. And of course, last but not least, definitely not least, I probably should have started there, issues ecological, climate change, drought, all sorts of natural disasters. We need to keep all of that in mind. And this helps us to map our ecosystem, because that's really what we work in. And there are so many factors that can have unintended consequences on our work that we just need to keep an eye on. And this is a lovely way of categorizing them and putting them into a kind of a spider web that helps you to draw the picture of what your ecosystem looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. And just on that, please unpack the word ecosystem for yourself, because the mistake a lot of organizations make when they're doing this model is they're very one-sided or single focused. You know, political is about the government and the political parties, but you also need to look at your immediate landscape and society at large. So it's a really good exercise to do. And as Mel said, use lots of colored paper, get as many people involved in your team as possible. And you'll be surprised what comes out, and just how much data and information you have on your ecosystem. But if you don't understand your ecosystem and you're not regularly reviewing your ecosystem, you are at threat, because if you don't watch what's happening, somebody will come up and bite you or take over from the side. So it's very important. It's a great model to use. All right, some key points. Find out who has the most influence. So 4 key points. Find out who has the most influence. Know your influencers. And those are not just the celebrities that have all the following on social media. Those are decision makers. Those are governing bodies. Those are organizational bodies. Those are oversight bodies. Those are movements. Those are the political sphere. Those are donors. Those are the community, your local tribal leaders. Focus on those who benefit most. Really unpack and understand those that benefit most from your work. Do you really know your beneficiaries? Do you, or are you just counting that we fed 100,000 children today? Do you know the demographic of where they're coming from, the complexities they have in their home environment, the unemployment rates, whether they've got water at home, whether they've got electricity at home, how far the children are walking to get to school, to get that meal? I was working on a project in Angola, and we kept on beating onto the donor that the children walk a very long distance to school every day. And we were fortunate that when the donor came to do a site visit, one of our program team said to the donor, "Come walk with me." And unintentionally, but very cleverly, walked home with one of the beneficiaries from the school. And after about 5 kilometers in the very hot Angola sun at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a dust road, the donor was like, "I'm tired." And we were like, "Yes, but this child does 7 kilometers each way twice a day to get to school and to get home from school." Now you appreciate the value of that meal that the child gets when they haven't had breakfast at home. So really understand your beneficiaries. See where your resources are most plentiful. Really critically unpack when you're doing your pestle model and when you're looking at this whole thing. Where are your resources? Where are your lowest hanging fruit? You know, are you going to continue to target just internationals? Are you going to target locals? Get that balanced fundraising mix, which we've harped on about so much through fundraising talk, but really, really unpack where are they most plentiful. And ladies and gentlemen, this will change. This will change every couple of months, every year, because the environment we work in changes so incredibly quickly. So you've got to constantly be looking at is where are those plentiful resources that you can go and pick those low-hanging fruit. And most importantly, have a game plan. Like any good sports star or Olympic medalist, they don't practice for a week and win that gold medal. It takes months and sometimes years of a real dedicated, focused game plan. But have that game plan. Know your game plan. Your team need to know the game plan so that you're all going in the same direction. You're not rowing in opposite directions and going around in circles.
Definitely. Kelvin, before you go on, I wanted to just quickly make a point about finding out who has the most influence. One of the sessions that you and I did not so long ago, we spoke about looking for the lion in the room.
Yeah.
And it's also important to keep in mind that the most influential person may not be the obvious one.
Yep.
And this requires a bit of lateral thinking and some detective work, because you may find an ally or a really valuable influencer in the most unlikely places. So keep your eye out for that kind of thing.
So Mel, just some storytelling. I was fortunate to be very successful with the corporate, and it wasn't because I had a great relationship with the CSI manager. It was because I had a great relationship with the CSI manager's assistant. And she got me into the room and got me into the right meetings and got me FaceTime. So often the people that can open the diary or open the door are sometimes your best influencers, because they know the business, they know the decision makers, they can influence when you get meetings, they can help you. So don't presume it's just the CSR manager or the CEO in a corporate, or the family trust, that it's a family member. Sometimes it's the administrator of the family trust that actually pulls the strings and decides which projects get funded.
I've actually gone as far as having, I won't say who, but the administrator of a very well-known local foundation actually give me advice on what to say and how to say it, and most importantly, when to say it. Very valuable. And you wouldn't have thought, it's not really where you would expect to find that information, but it was invaluable and I got the grant. So let's move on to the 4 steps. So like a lot of the things that we've talked about in the last couple of months, this is very much a collaborative effort. You are not going to see the whole picture just on your own. So you really need to start off with a brainstorming session. We always joke, in my case, it's never a storm, it's more of a sort of a light shower, but still I have something to offer, even if it's small. But have a brainstorming session with your team. Speak to beneficiaries, speak to other people in the community who maybe are not direct beneficiaries, but have an interest in the success of the community. What do they think? Who do they think the people are who need to be consulted?
Speak to your donors.
Absolutely. Please speak to your donors. Funny enough, Calvin, you're the one who taught me that. I was always so afraid to make contact with the donor in case I offend them or I waste their time. Please don't think like I did. Go in there. Donors are people. They love to be consulted. They love to have their opinions valued and requested. Please speak to your donors. They are an incredibly great source of information for you.
And they're your partners and your investors. And having sat in that seat, it's so rewarding when a beneficiary comes to you and says, can I bounce this off you? We want to do something different, or we want you to just get your input in a workshop or your thoughts on a paper. So for once, you're not asking for money. But secondly, you're respecting their professionalism and their opinion and their expertise. And remember that they don't only fund your organization. So they have intel which quietly comes out without giving names, but their opinion is an opinion on the sector, not only on your organization. So they're a great resource. And if you've got that relationship, abuse it. Sorry, Mel, carry on.
No, absolutely invaluable advice, that. So once you've brainstormed and you now have this shopping list of names, then you start to categorize them. Use the PESTLE analysis. Put people into groups. Once you have that, you can prioritize. And from there, you can develop a communication plan. Kel?
Thank you. Right, brainstorming. And that's where I put the colorful pieces of blocks in here. Use colorful paper, use flip charts. And if you're going to do it virtually, get on top of Zoom as far as people can color in and paste and play. But make a list of all stakeholders. Exhaust that list. Right down to your service clubs, your Rotaries, your Lions, your volunteer groups, the local old age home, the local council, the local school, the beneficiaries. Just exhaust the list, exhaust it. Then what you do is you rank those stakeholders on a scale of 1 to 5, according to a common criteria, such as an interest or a project outcome, or an interest in the subject. So what I do is I use sticky notes. So we put all the sticky notes down on a stakeholder piece of paper, and then all the ones that are that stakeholder, we put on a separate piece of paper, and you start building this lovely puzzle. And then, are there any surprises? So for now, look at what's happened with Brexit and UK funding. Look at what's happened with the USA funding. DFID suddenly, going restructuring. So are there any surprises that you can anticipate? And then which stakeholders have the most influence? Again, going back to that influences, and really, really look at that carefully and think long and hard about each stakeholder. So as you list them, unpack them. And then which stakeholders do we have the most or least contact with? And obviously the stakeholders you have the most contact with is the easiest. But you don't want to keep going back to the same pond for fishing. You will eventually deplete the fish because they can't regenerate quick enough. You need to find other ponds. So the most influence, yes, they're the easiest ones to go to and the ones that know you best. But you also need to start tipping into those that you have the least contact with. And it's human nature. We go back to this thing because, we know the people in it, and it's easier to go back to the donors that have given, but you've got to start also engaging with donors that you've had least contact with. And then lastly, which donors might we have to make a special effort to ensure engagement? So you really got to unpack that one as well, in the sense of which donors do you really need to make that special effort with? And you'll be surprised. I've had the unfortunate situation where I just didn't click with a particular donor. I mean, the CSR manager and we just didn't click. And I did the defensive thing and thought, you know what? Not going to happen. It's fine. But then forced myself to make a conscious effort and really understand where she was coming from and why we were banging heads. And the irony is we were both so passionate that we weren't hearing each other. And today we're mates. She supported some great programs, and we've built a wonderful relationship and friendship professionally. So, sometimes the ones that you bang head with or that are least likely can sometimes become your best donors. But because we think, we don't quite fit, or we didn't get on, or we don't gel, so we just sort of put them at the bottom of the pile. But no, you really need to make the effort of who are the ones that we're going to make that special effort with, that we are going to be determined to consistently get to try and influence. And remember, going back to the basics of fundraising 101, the role of the fundraiser is to introduce the opportunity to the donor and to give them the opportunity to partner with you and support your beneficiaries. So it's not personal when they say no, but you're being selfish if you're not putting the opportunity on the table, giving them the menu card to choose from. They may decide they don't want anything on your menu today, but tomorrow they might come back and say, hey, let's retalk. And again, back to 101, it's about relationship building. It takes time. So even this, it's a great workshop. There's some great tools, but you're not going to have 100% increase in funding in the next week because you do this. This is a process. This is changing behavior. This is engaging with your team so that you're all on the same page. So brainstorming is important, and it's important, and I plead with you that you put aside the time, you invite the right people into the room, and most importantly, you make the most of the time together. So you're disciplined to really focus on this task, because it will reap rewards if you do it correctly. Well,
absolutely, Kelvin. And before we go away from that brainstorming, you'll notice that Kelvin and I talk a lot about donors and who the donors are in the room, remembering that there are so many stakeholders that we all need to take into account when we work within an organization. We tend to focus on donors and fundraising because that's the space that is our natural habitat. But just remembering that when we talk about stakeholders, we aren't just looking at donors. We're looking at anyone who has some kind of impact or is impacted upon by your organization. So it's very broad.
Let me move the slides.
Right, then what we're going to do is we're going to categorize. And we love doing this. I love doing it because it's quite interesting. You'll sit with the particular person. I'm going to use my phone as a, this is my sticky note. And you'll think, oh, they go over there. Oh, no, they don't. They actually go right to the other side, on that side of the room. But what is the thing that ties them to your organization? It may not actually be the thing they do for a living. It may be something completely different, but what ties them to the project or the subject? You know, if you work in ECD, someone like Professor Eric Atmore, that I'm sure the Cape Town and even the Joburg people know, Eric is an absolute fountain of knowledge on all things ECD. He is my go-to guy when I need to know anything about the early childhood development sector. He is definitely a stakeholder. He's not a donor, but he's an influencer. He has ties to government, he has ties to the nonprofit sector, he has ties to corporate. So how do I categorize him? So I draw a little bit on social media and I say he's an influencer. And I put him on my influencer list. Again, look for surprises. I have been incredibly surprised by the value that certain stakeholders add, just out of the blue, that I had no expectation of the information that I was going to get and how powerful it would be, or the introduction, or the door that was opened. So keep that in mind. And I think that it's really important, something Kelvin and I are always at great pains when we train fundraisers to say, is that everyone has potential. Everyone potentially can be the person who changes things for you. And with that in mind, we need to treat people as if they're valuable, even though they haven't actually given us the value yet. Because to put it a little less elegantly, the toes you tread on today may be attached to the rear you have to kiss tomorrow. So in doing this exercise, you get to avoid treading on those toes. You learn who has the most influence. Who do we have the most or least contact with? Now, when you talk about that, it's like, well, if we don't have any contact with them, then are they a stakeholder? Of course they are. Perhaps we need to have closer contact with them. And which ones might we have to like do really something special for? Might be a donor, it might not be. It might be someone who can help us to connect with our community. It might be someone who helps us to connect with government. It's really interesting once you get into this. I did this exercise just the other day with one of my clients, and I was totally focused on the school and the environment, because it's a group of schools, the environment in the school. And one of them said, but what about the universities that take our graduates? I hadn't even given that a thought. So another reminder that we really need to involve as many people as possible in this process, because you get different voices and different opinions. Kel?
Yep, thank you. Just checking the chats. Right, more questions. So in all your stakeholder mapping, do they have a financial or emotional interest in the outcome of your work? Is it positive or negative? And that's an interesting question, because as fundraisers, we are wired to focus on the impact, on the positive. But can a stakeholder focus on the negative of your work? You know, what is your environmental footprint? Is the chairman of your board got a dodgy past? You know, are you accepting dirty money from donors? Are you doing the right thing by constantly just giving and never exiting a community? And you will always have people looking at you critically. So it's very important to map and ask yourself that question. Is that with every stakeholder, financial or emotional? Categorize it if they're both, and also positive and or negative, and that could be both. So and I think it's good to look at that.
Definitely, Kelvin. And I think, you know, the other thing you and I speak about quite often is risk analysis and risk mitigation. And this kind of stakeholder analysis plays beautifully into that process.
Absolutely.
Because you need to, there will always be curveballs. Let's face it, that's life. But the more you can prepare for, the fewer surprises up ahead.
Absolutely. And out of every crisis comes an opportunity. So even if your organization is going through a really tough time, you've got to find the opportunity. So part of this workshop, which has been crammed into 1 hour, which is normally a day program, this is the fundamental basics for your risk analysis and your risk strategy as well. So it's not just about doing this, but you're also contributing to your risk and how you're going to mitigate those risks. What motivates them the most? So what motivates the critics that are going to hit you with all the negatives? What motivates the positives and the people that are going to support you and endorse your work? Because remember, an influencer might not be able to give you money, but they can talk very positively about your work. They can influence you. They can promote your work, or they can talk negatively about it. Which of your project information is relevant to them, and what is the best way to relay that information? So you can see we started to bring in the comms as well. You talk to people differently. You talk to a donor differently to talk to the media, talk differently to your board, to your beneficiaries, to the critique, to those that critique you and criticize your work. And then what is the current opinion of your work? Is that opinion based on accurate information? I'm going to repeat that. What is the current opinion of your work, your organization? And is it based on accurate information? Because often, my personal opinion, often what we find is those people that chirp and shout the loudest and scream and throw their toys about your work and have an opinion on social media are ill-informed and actually don't have the whole picture of your work.
But the worst part about them, sorry, Carl, I have to interrupt.
No,
this is the best. Sun Tzu, perception is reality, and perceptions are the hardest things to change.
And that's our responsibility to change those perceptions, because remember that your donors are watching you as well. And if your critics are criticizing you and you're not taking the opportunity, and listen to the words, taking the opportunity to turn them into a supporter of your work as opposed to someone that criticizes your work, you're going to put your donors at risk. And there is nothing more rewarding than taking a disgruntled, grumpy, ill-informed critic of your work and converting them to be an ambassador of your work. So take that as an opportunity and as a challenge. You're not going to convert all of them. That's life. And some you just got to accept you're not going to change, but you've got to manage it. And then who influences their opinion? And are those influencers also your stakeholders? Because where are they getting this information from? Who's feeding them? Because often the person that's shouting the loudest is being fed. Where there's fuel, there's fire. It's being fed somewhere. So how do you find out who's doing the feeding, and are those your stakeholders? If they're not likely to be supportive of your project, what can you do to win their support? Which is what I've just been saying. You've got to win them over. And if they're taking the time to critique and challenge you, they're actually interested. They want to have a conversation. They want to have a robust debate. Take it offline, but have that conversation. And if you can't win their support, what can you do to manage their opposition to your organization? So these are things you've got to start questioning as well. So you've got to start having a real, and I always say to people, you've got to be able to look at yourself as an organization squarely in the mirror and look for those wrinkles, look for those lines, look for the aged parts. And you've got to have that honest, hard look at yourself in the mirror as an organization. And don't be afraid to have that honesty, because it's not easy and it takes very courageous people to ask these difficult questions, but it is important that you ask them. Mel?
So we're going to move on quickly to an example of how you can do a matrix. This was adapted from the grant making guide from Next Generation Consultants. And I would really recommend that you get your hands on a copy of this publication. Next Generation is run by an amazing woman called Rihanna Rousseau. And one of her real jobs in the sector is to set up CSI departments. And there is so much intel in that grant making guide that you can use to influence corporate donors. You wouldn't believe it. So she doesn't use a 5-step, she uses a 3-step. She uses most, average, and least. And she asks questions. Who would be affected? Who will benefit? Who will be responsible for implementing measures to mitigate negative impacts? And then from there, she groups the stakeholders. And there are a lot of ways that you can do this. I mean, you can just sort of start a table. Sorry, Jessica's just asked me to repeat the publication. It's called the Grant Making Guide, and it's by Next Generation Consultants. There's a little reference on the bottom of the slide. And Mo, I will ask her. I'm not sure if she will. Sometimes she will and sometimes she won't, but she's amazing. And if she is in Cape Town and presenting, I recommend that you hunt her down. She's awesome. But she looks from a very objective outsider's perspective at that whole stakeholder matrix and how we, as whether we're a CSI person or whether we're an NPO or a company, how we can maximize the circle of influence that each stakeholder has to work for our organization. And if not working for our organization, at least not working against it. So that's one way that we've identified that you can use to map out and analyze your stakeholders.
Sorry, let me move the slide. All right. And sorry, Mel, I did adjust this or amend it to be more visual. So before we get on to this, you know, often we hear of nonprofit organizations where they land a new donor. And when you unpack it and say, well, how did we find this donor? And sometimes you find your current donors introduce you to new donors. That is a great reflection of great stakeholder mapping, and your donor clearly understands your work. So the matrix, what you really want to do is place your donors and your stakeholders. I'm correcting myself, your stakeholders, not just your donors, your stakeholders. Your lowest stakeholder that has the lowest power and the lowest interest in your organization, you're going to monitor. The stakeholder that has the lowest interest in your organization, that has the highest power, you keep satisfied. So that might be government partners, sector partners, policy influencers and decision makers, lobby and activist groups in your sector or in the greater society, your board. You've got to keep them satisfied. Then those that have the lowest power but the highest interest in your organization, you need to keep informed. And then obviously your shining stars are those that have the highest power and the highest interest. And those are the ones you engage and actively seek to influence. And what you want to do is map each stakeholder and get them on the journey. Because ultimately, if you can get your stakeholders to the star position, right up in that right corner, you're doing great jobs. And there'll be a constant new pipeline of new stakeholders and new people as society changes every day. So map them, put them in the matrix. And what I would suggest, again, lots of sticky notes and have big pieces of paper and just pluck. And then sit with the team and you'll find you move things around because this person says something that says, okay, we thought about this differently. They actually are a high interest, high power. Because remember, different people's perception. And that's why it's also very important that you have a mix of people in the room, not just the fundraising team and the marketing team and the exco team. Have people from the programs. If possible, have some beneficiaries. If possible, have an existing and loyal donor. If you really want to be brave, have somebody that just, that's critiqued your work before, because they might unpack some stuff that you've never thought of. So it's important to do your matrix and to shoot the lights out with eventually moving as many people as possible. You're not going to move everyone, but you want to move as many people as possible into that engaged and active seeking to influence your organization. Mel?
And then we come to my favorite thing, communicating, because that's really one of the major outcomes that you want from this process, is a plan for communications. Because, I mean, somehow my of disappeared down towards the end of the line there, but stakeholders only need the right amounts of information. I don't know how many of you are parents, but there was an amazing advert on television several years ago. And to be honest, so it clearly wasn't that great an advert. I can't remember what the product was, but the story was incredible. It's a little boy, and he sits down next to his mum and he says, "Mum, where do I come from?" And you can see mum gets that rabbit in the headlights kind of expression. And she sort of goes, "Well, when mummy and her daddy really love each other," and it kind of fades out and fades back in to, "and then you were born." And the little boy goes, "Oh, Sipho comes from Diepsloot." Just give people the information they need. And that's what this process allows us to do. You don't want to overshare. You don't want to appear secretive and keeping your cards so close to your chest that nobody knows what's going on. Aim for that targeted strategic communication with high power, high interest people. Build trust. Because people give to causes they understand, people give to causes they believe in, people give to causes they trust. So critically, as nonprofits, it's our job to foster that trust, to create the space where trust can grow. So that's really important. If you've got someone who's not a raving fan, try and see if you can find a raving fan who's on the same level. You know, we talk about peer fundraising. Do a little bit of peer influencing. Ask them to explain why they're a raving fan, because that kind of influence you don't have and you never will. So find those people who can offer you that degree of influence. Communicate early. And I think COVID was the biggest lesson we could ever have learned about communication. Communicate early and communicate often, because people need time to think before they make a decision. And I'm going to give you a great example of that. When we all first started doing face-to-face fundraising in shopping malls, and I was explaining to a client the other day that all the gray hair that you see popping up all over my head is as a direct result of face-to-face fundraising. We didn't communicate with the donors at all. They signed their debit orders and then we left them alone, because if they remembered that they were donors, they'd stop giving. But then they stopped giving and we were like, what did we do wrong? We didn't communicate. We need to communicate with our stakeholders. They need to know what we're doing. They can't brag about how awesome we are if they're not armed with information. So target your communication to the level of knowledge that that particular stakeholder needs.
Thanks, Mel. And we've done record time. Wow. Okay.
We're on time for once. Questions.
We normally always say we need 15 minutes, and today we've got 14. And yo, well done.
Yeah, yes.
All right, let's look at the chat.
Marie has a great question. Shall I read it out? Because I don't know the answer, so maybe you do. Okay. A great idea to attract a wide diversity of stakeholders is to attract a wide diversity of stakeholders to a mapping session. Any suggestions on how to actually persuade people outside the organization, government, business, who obviously have their own stuff to do, to give up a day to join you?
Lovely question. So I will try and answer it, and Mel, you can jump in and help me. So if you've got children, it's no different to the school saying, we need to have a meeting with the parents to look at the future of the school, the demographic of the school, to make sure that your child has good quality education. I guarantee you most of the parents will be going to that meeting because you have a vested interest. It's your child.
Mm.
It's no different to if you work in a corporate and the CEO sends an email out and says, guys, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I will be in the foyer and I want as many of you to come down and chat to me because I want your viewpoint and understanding of how you feel we are running this business. You will go and chat to the CEO because that's your job on the line. It is no difference in our sector, ladies and gentlemen. It's exactly what Melanie was saying. You know, that whole thing of you can't bug a donor unless you're putting in a grant application or a report. Twaddle. These are your stakeholders. You have a fiduciary responsibility to engage with society, to best position your organization to continue to do the good work you do. Because if every single one of you are true to your value and the integrity of why the organization is there, if you're not doing this, you're doing something wrong. Because by planning, by invest, and I know it's difficult. I'll be the first one to say where I've sat in CEO chairs and I'm like, when are we going to find the time to do this workshop? Because there's reports and deadlines and budgets and board meetings and fundraising. But you have to invest the time. You have to invest the time. It's no different to if you never maintain your house or your property and then you wonder why it devalues. If you never nourish your child, they will not grow. So it's an investment, and you have to change that mindset where you're starting on the wrong foot if you're saying, how do we get these people to come and work with us? You should have such a good relationship that they want to jump at the opportunity to come and engage with you. It's how you communicate. It's how you do the ask. And it's about putting a bit of heart on the sleeve and saying, guys, we really want to do a stakeholder mapping exercise that's going to be valuable, that's going to give us the feedback we need to be able to be a more effective, efficient, and delivering better service to the community. I challenge you that most stakeholders will say, I'm in, because you're showing them that you're investing in planning the future of your organization. You're not reactive. So it's how you ask, it's how you put it across to them that their input is exceptionally valuable. It's not just another workshop and a free cup of coffee. Their input is valuable. We value you as a stakeholder. We want your input. We want your feedback. We want your contribution to help us shape the future of this organization and to map ourselves correctly. So yeah, I would say it's how you ask, and you're not going to get everyone that you put on the list, but if you can get 70% or 60%, hey, fantastic. But make sure you get that balance. It can't only be staff. It can't only be beneficiaries. It needs to be all those other influencers and stakeholders as well.
Yeah,
Mel,
and
do
I
you want
think
to add to that?
I actually have two things I'd like to add to that. A way for me to attract particularly an external stakeholder would be to offer access to the results. It's all about data. It's all about knowledge. The more we know, the more power we have. And it could be that that stakeholder perhaps realizes that that information could be useful to him or her as well. Yeah. So I would definitely make that offer to the room, not the general public, but you know, if you attend, I'm happy to provide you with the results of the study that you may find interesting in your work. That's certainly one way. If it's someone who has been a detractor, who's been a critic, I would offer them the opportunity to have their say, to get up on their soapbox and explain why they think we're awful. But by the same token, I would encourage him or her to stay for the whole session and hear our side of the tale. And I'm always surprised at how well that works. People want to be heard. They want their voices to be heard. So it's a difficult one. It's not easy. Maria, I think you've probably, for me, you've touched on the thing that I would struggle with the most. I'm not always comfortable asking people. Yeah. But I think, as Kelvin so clearly said, it's in the way we do it and looking at what's in it for them.
Yeah.
It's got to be a win-win for them.
Yeah. And mainly going back to donors, please don't fall into default and ask the donor that's giving you the longest and the donor you have the best relationship with. I would say, yes, get that person in the room, but also get a relatively new donor in the room. Or even if you really want to be brave, ask a donor that turned you down to come and participate.
Yeah.
That would be really interesting. But we all default to Mary Lou because we know her so well and she's given us money for 10 years.
And
no.
She's a raving fan and she tells us what we want to hear.
Absolutely. So get a mix of donors, a mix of beneficiaries, a mix of stakeholders, a mix of staff. You know, that person in management that's a thorn in your side, that is just always negative and, you know, we've got too much work to do and we're so tired. Get them in the room because you need to understand why they're feeling that way. And they might have some valuable information that you can really, really, really unpack. So be brave. It's not going to be an easy journey. It's not going to be an easy exercise. It's going to challenge you. It's going to be scary. But that's when you get the most meat on the bone because you really get to unpack and understand. And it will shift your thinking completely. And again, as we say in all the workshops, please get a neutral person to help you. Do not let the chairman of the board or the CEO facilitate this because the staff will say what the CEO wants them to hear. And don't you facilitate it. You need to actually be a participant so that you can't influence either. So find a volunteer that's willing to facilitate, or if you need to pay a facilitator, but get somebody neutral that can do it for you, that can also push back and manage the room when the shouting and screaming starts, because it will happen. But also celebrate at the end of the day. You know, when I've sat in programs similar to this workshop, you know, at the end of the day, you're tired, it's been a long day, and everyone's like, oh, but celebrate the stuff that the knowledge, the information you've got, the participants' contribution, and celebrate with the whole organization afterwards. You know, whether it's sharing a photograph or sharing 5 points with the board to say, we did this great session, and this is what came out. We need to look at this. We need to think about that. And hey, we're doing this really, really well because everybody says so. So, and lastly, my other suggestion is in the prep work, get either it yourself or if you're brave enough, get somebody else to look online about what's been said about you. So look at your social media posts and all the comments for the last 6 months. Look at who's looking at your website. You know, is it only 40-year-old woman in Constantia in Cape Town that are looking at your website? Why is everybody not looking at your website? Who's reading your annual report? Who is giving you money? Unpack your data, how often people are giving, why they're giving, if they're increasing their giving, if they're decreasing their giving. What is the perception of your brand from society? Those are the things you need to unpack as well and bring that data to the room to say, we've done some analysis. This is what the polls are telling us. What do we think? So that you're never going to get 20 million people in the room. But if you can do that data analysis beforehand, and ideally if you get somebody that's not too close to the organization, so a volunteer, a board member, a donor, to do that unpacking for you and bring it to the room, I think that will also add huge value and open conversations and provoke robust, healthy debate. But it's a great session to do. And as I said right in the beginning, we're in October. If you haven't already done your planning for next year, you're a little bit late. But I would encourage you to really try and do this exercise before the end of the year. It's a day at a push. You can do it half a day, depending on the room and the size of your organization. But it's an investment so that you really, really, really have a clear understanding of your organization and all your stakeholders and how you can deal with those that are against you and how you can grow those that are with you. Well, any other questions we need to answer?
There's one last one because time is marching on. This is an anonymous one. Very interesting. How easy do you think it is to do this exercise internally?
Very hard. I'm not going to lie. Depends on the so I'm going to jump in now. Please add. Depends on the dynamic of your organization, depends on the culture of your organization. If you have leadership that leads with a big stick and that it's created a fear culture where they rule the roost and what they say goes, it's going to be, you're going to have this in the room. People will come to the meeting for the free coffee, but you're going to have this. If you have an open, engaging culture where leadership is happy to be challenged and has encouraged the team to robustly debate and challenge stuff and come up with new solutions, it could be a very great session. But it's still going to rip the plaster off a couple of wounds. There are going to be some times where there's dead silence. There's going to be some times where there's screaming and shouting. There's going to be some times where there's crying, and there's going to be lots of laughter. It's going to be an emotional roller coaster of a day, but it's a great team building exercise as well. So I would say, just as Nike says, just do it.
I like that. I know I said that was the last one, but this is a really good question, and I really want to answer it.
So you didn't answer the question.
You're
supposed to also contribute.
What
to the last question?
Okay, would you say that this stakeholder mapping process is step one of strat planning? I don't know if I would necessarily say that it's step one. It's definitely a step. It is part of your strat planning process. Whether it's step one,
who knows?
I think no. What do you think, Cal?
I would push that back and say, depending where the question's coming from, I'm now being a politician, depending where the question's coming from, because depending again on the organization, who does the strategy, how participative is the strategy session, how transparent is strategy. If you have a very closed organization where the CEO and the board develop the strategy and push it down, going to be difficult. If you have a very participative strategy with senior leadership and your board and other stakeholders, it will be easier. Whether this is step one, again, you will know best in your organization, depending on the culture. What I would challenge you to do is, and thank you for asking anonymously and for being brave to ask that, I would say to Anonymous, when you've got the recording of the session, share it with your CEO and challenge your CEO and say, what do you think? Should we be doing this? And should we be doing this as step one of our strategy? And empower the CEO and the leadership team to collectively make that decision. Because the first step is obviously to get leadership to buy into this concept. Once leadership is bought in, because I've been in sessions where people get invited to a meeting, they don't know what it's about, they get the surprise, and the leadership team with outside stakeholders are going, huh? So you need to make sure leadership has a clear understanding of the objectives of the session, so that you also don't have a complete rabbit in the headlight look when you walk into a room and you go, really? And your outside stakeholders know more than your inside stakeholders.
I think maybe just to add to that, a stakeholder analysis goes much further than just fundraising.
Yeah.
So if it is a step one in your strategy, it maybe should be a step one in your organizational strategy, as opposed to your fundraising strategy, if that makes sense. And Ina's asking about, and I know I said no more, but this is also a really good question.
It's a great question. Thank you, Ina.
Would you review annually? And if you're a nationwide organization with regions, do you do it regionally or nationwide?
Well done, Ina. I love your thinking. I think you're on the right path. I would do it annually because, I mean, what we planned for 2020 is out the window with COVID. Who ever thought? I would do it annually. And if you are a national organization, I would encourage that. And I'm grateful that you asked the question and share, is do it in each region. And then the results almost feed into the national one, because a regional hub or operation of a national organization is also a stakeholder. So I would encourage you, do it regionally and then bring it into national and do the same exercise naturally with the regional input. And I think it'll be a lovely exercise. And I would really encourage you, is that you're brave enough and you do this, is that you actually share without putting too much out on the table, but maybe give this group feedback of how that went. the successes and the frustration and the hurdles you had to overcome, because it is difficult when you're working in a national organization with regional operations and regional hubs, the same as continental or globally, because stakeholders change in each community. You know, what works, I always say, what works in the Eastern Cape doesn't work in Gauteng. So you will find a little bit of a change. There'll be some common denominators, but you will definitely find each one has those lovely gems that will come out of it.
Definitely.
Really, I'm going to be the grunt of time.
Oh, he's going into schoolmaster mode. So let's quickly look at the upcoming sessions. Cal, do you want to take us through?
Yeah. So next week, are you ready for 2021? Ladies and gentlemen, we're at the end of October. Scary. So our guest next week will be Carolyn. I'm not even going to try and pronounce her surname. And she's really going to unpack how you do your planning, and are you ready for 2021 in the sense of all your pre-planning so that you can hit 2021 running. We know 2020 has been a difficult year. Please God, may 2021 be a better year. But we're going to give you some tools so that you can end off the year nicely and be ready for next year. And then Mel, do you want to talk about Giving Tuesday?
Yes, so Giving Tuesday this year falls on the 1st of December, which is also World AIDS Day. So that's going to be interesting. But basically, Giving Tuesday comes out of the US, and it is traditionally the day after Cyber Monday, which is the Monday after Black Friday in the US, which is the Thanksgiving weekend. And it's kind of the antidote to all of the spending that happens on Black Friday. And we have managed to track down the people who are spearheading Giving Tuesday in South Africa, and they will be unpacking the ins and outs of it for us on the 5th of November. So please join us for that. I think it's going to be really interesting. Please tell all your friends. I think the next 2 sessions are going to be don't miss it ones. So
Absolutely.
We're looking forward to seeing you there.
So ladies and gentlemen, as we always say, please remember this is recorded. It will be up by the end of the day on the YouTube channel. We will send the link on the WhatsApp group. If you're not on our WhatsApp group, get hold of Melanie or I, and we will gladly add you. And please use those resources. They are yours to use. There's many of these webinars that we've recorded with ourselves and our guest speakers that are available on that YouTube channel. It's a great learning curve. Share it with everybody. Please invite friends, colleagues, and guests to our next 2 sessions. It is an open network. It's not a closed session. And we encourage you to join us in the future. Please remember to keep the communication open on the WhatsApp group, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Please stay safe. Goodbye.
Thanks, Cal. Stay safe, everybody. I don't have to tell you to keep warm anymore. Now I'm saying stay cool, and don't let the dog bark during our sessions.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.